want to talk about Katy Keene, this comic book series that I'm newly fascinated by, newly interested in. But first, I want to thank you guys for having me here. This is a very special jaunt out, sort of post-lockdown. It's nice to be able to, come together and share some ideas about research and hear what other people are doing. And I'm hoping that this paper will pick up on some of the ideas of play and agency that were raised in the paper before this. So, if we have the first slide, please. That in the years after the Second World War, the children's clothing market boomed, and teenage and sub-teen girls were described as the leading commercial cultural figures in this new market. Clothing made up the bulk of teenage discretionary spending at this time, and on both sides of the Atlantic, girls were becoming more and more interested in clothing, more able to buy their own clothing, and were asserting their taste and buying power. And another slide, please. The comic books that were produced in this period that are aimed at young female readers intersect with this phenomenal rise in fashion consumption, and clothing, both real and imagined, both practical and fantastic, plays an important role in many of these periodicals. Some of these are American, some of these are British. I'm sort of looking at a sample of these in a wider project. Fashion is present in both textual and in the paratextual elements of these periodicals, and they reflect the central importance of clothing and self-fashioning in readers' lives. Next slide. So Katy Keene comics that I'm going to talk about today ran between 1949 and 1961. It had a number of different titles, different variations of the title. There was Katy Keene, the Katy Keene Fashion Book, Katy Glamour, and the Katy Keene Pin-Up Parade. It sort of changes in and out of these titles over the time. It was part of the Archie comics series, so Katy existed as a character from 1945, but in 1949 got her own title. It was briefly revived in the 1980s. There's a Katy Con that you can attend to if you were a fan of Katy. And there was a TV adaptation of the character, if not the storylines, in the 2020s as part of the Riverdale series, which linked with the Archie comics. So she's sort of enduringly popular, despite the fact that nobody seems to know anything about her. So the comics centre on Katy. She's the main comic. She is a model, an actress, a singer. She's marketed as America's queen of pin-ups and fashions. Her interest in fashion and her status as a glamorous person push consumption of all kinds to the forefront of the storylines and in the materials, particularly the paper dolls that were offered in every issue. These paper dolls offer a sort of playful paratextual element, if you like, that allows the readers to engage intellectually, haptically, and creatively with the representations of clothing on the page. The Katy comics both address and shape readers in responses to fashion. They speak to and of their anxieties, their fantasies around clothing, and ultimately they sort of help to enculture the post-war girl as a consumer of fashion. I can have the next slide, please. So in this section I want to talk about Katy and her readers and how they produce clothing, because Katy is unusual in that all of the content of Katy is generated by readers. It's all generated by children. The importance of clothing to the readers of Katy is made abundantly clear in every issue, and this is because the visual content and the majority of the storylines and the comics were created by readers. Readers contribute the designs for the clothes and the other consumer products that you see used in every one of the narratives. The next slide, please. It's a lot of these. So this is Bill Woggan on the extreme left. Bill Woggan was the cartoonist or the comic book illustrator who invented Katy. In 1949, he believed that she was going to be a star and moved out, took away his family from his full-time job, packed up, and gave himself over full-time to creating Katy. He often included photographs of himself and his family in the magazines, so you could see who he was, you could be reassured that this is a real person really reading your letters, reading your stories. But the key feature of it is the reader's contributions. I can't quite figure out how he got the contributions for the first issue. I can't find how he did that, but they are real people. But in every issue of Katy afterwards, there's advertisements saying, you know, send in your designs, send in your drawings, we'd love to see them. If I could have the next slide, I'll show you how it works. So that in every page where Katy is seen, she's always dressed, in every page that you see her, a reader is given a tagline. Their name and their address, often, sometimes their age, is printed beside it. So that we have a sense of the reader as this active participant in the comic. Their contributions are acknowledged, they're made prominent in the work, their names are there, they're prominent, and it's possible from these names to glean an accurate picture of the geographical, the social, the racial makeup of the readership. But I have the next slide as well. So sometimes they publish these photo galleries of readers in the special editions with their names and their addresses underneath. You were invited to write to readers you took an interest in as pen friends, you know, to create friendships among this. And the vast majority of them are young white girls. But there are some more unusual readers that get a lot of credit too. So I can have the next slide here. So in this, so this was the 1957 edition of Katy Glamour. It makes special acknowledgement of the contributions from male fans, including Merrill Miller, who's 17 years old, down here at the bottom. He sent in a snazzy headshot. He's 6'2", has blue eyes and blonde hair. I think he's hoping some readers will write to him. He hopes to be an artist or an art teacher someday. Above him we've got Larry Creel, who is a 17-year-old who joined the US Navy Reserves in 1955 and went on active duty in 1956. These are clearly unusual readers of Katy. They're not the intended market, and yet they are submitting not only designs, but Larry Creel submits a storyline involving himself and Katy. They're very, very involved. The next slide, please. We also have Willie Smith, the clothes designer, who was fascinated by Katy and plays tribute to her at the end of a 1978 fashion show. He has a model dressed in a Katy outfit. He says when he was about 11 years old, reading Katy Keene, he used to send 100 to 200 sketches a month, and even won a birthday contest. So there's quite a lot of designers. You can go back and find their names and find what they were designing and submitting. Betsy Johnson said she submitted a lot but never got anything printed. Anna Sui got some things printed. You know, it seems to be a forum for a lot of designers to try their hand on designing. So, what were they designing? So if I can have the next slide, please. You can see this is the range of things that appeared in the first issue. So we've got a full-length outfit dressed in playing card pips. It's quite glamorous outfit, accessorized with fur. We've got this slightly bizarre outfit in the middle. It's accessorized with a banana hat and a fish handbag, and finally a pineapple dress. Like even these really apparently eccentric designs still conform to notions of clothing and dress. I mean, there's still obviously a dress, there's still obviously a jacket and gloves and things. They're visually arresting, but there's still a sense that the readers aren't letting their imaginations run riot. They're actually constrained by conventions, and conventions of how they want to represent Katy. That in order to take part in the community, there seems to be a sort of set of mutually agreed but unspoken rules that Katy must never really be made to look ugly or foolish. You know, she must somehow appear glamorous. And outlandish accessories are acceptable, but you can't sort of go completely outlandish on the whole outfit itself. But because people are designing these and sending them in, the pages of Katy function as a space for self-expression and for public display of that. It's removed from the usual economic constraints we would have around clothing. And it's removed from gender constraints too, that even if the young readers and contributors are not able to buy these things or wear these things themselves, they're able to showcase this talent for their peers. Through fashioning Katy then, the readers engage in a kind of self-fashioning, a process by which the individual consciously crafts a public persona in response to the demands and standards of their society. Katy is a public forum in which readers can generate and display social identity to a community that understands and appreciates it. Can I have the next slide, please? So I want in this section to talk about clothing in the text and the way that clothing shapes narratives. Clothing plays, understandably perhaps, a very important role in the storylines of Katy, and most of the plots are concerned with Katy getting dressed into various different outfits. That she's, I don't know, trying on outfits for a date or something, so that Lil Woggan can cycle through as many reader contributions as possible and showcase them all. The very first story in the Katy Keene fashion book, #1 from 1955, is called Katy Keene's Fashion Show. You can imagine what happens. But it's about the embarrassment that Katy's boyfriend, K.O., causes when he fails to behave in an appropriate manner at this fashion show. He applauds her loudly, he catcalls the other models, he doesn't understand what he's supposed to be looking at, he doesn't understand why she just won't come home, wearing, that's nice, let's leave. So I can have the slide. This is how it opens. I'm going to read out some of these texts, it's quite small. K.O. Kelly is Irish, it's a bit racist. Anyway, Katy says to him, K.O., it's very sweet of you to come along and watch me model in the fashion show. He says, Begorra, I'd do anything for you, Katy, me doll. You'd probably be bored with all the chiffon and souffle. She says, bored with all that fancy stuff to eat? No. And she has to explain to him that chiffon is not food. And he says to her, but you'd look very good in rags, my princess. He's trying his best, but he is not a sophisticated consumer. And afterwards, when Katy is wondering what he liked best, when she comes out and says, what did you enjoy most in the show? He says, I liked the blonde model a lot, but the red-haired one was nice too. And he doesn't understand what he's supposed to be seeing. His ignorance then is set against the sort of worldliness of the readers as they've constructed themselves, and their great appreciation for and taste in fashion. K.O.'s kind of a foil for the people who don't understand fashion, and of course by participating in Katy, you do understand. This one story has a total of 19 separate outfits designed by readers, ranging from diaphanous evening gowns to slinky fishtail dresses, and I think most significantly this red plaid twin set with a full circle skirt, a white cinched belt, and it's worn with a matching cropped jacket with sloping shoulders, a stand collar and self-covered buttons. And this, I think, deliberately echoes the style of Christian Dior's new look. This is a reader who's paying attention to what high fashion should look like on the female body. But while fashion is treated as endlessly disposable in Katy, these beautiful characters moving through an endless changing parade of possessions, the clothes they wear are actually quite complex. So as Roland Barthes suggests that fashion that's written or drawn functions semiologically speaking like a true mythology of clothing, these drawn clothes share a language, they function as language in Katy. They're a way of the readers speaking to each other and speaking about clothing. The drawings are mythic in the sense that they're fantasies of unreal clothing, of clothes that never existed, but in the sense that they are complex signs which, through a community of young readers, in a community of understanding readers, people can express themselves, declare their shared love of Katy and their shared desire to clothe her, their artistic skill, their taste, and their readiness to take part in a world of wider fashion. In this way, the magazine encultures the reader by allowing them to display their own cultural preferences. And then the next slide, please. I want to talk about clothing in the paratexts of Katy. So while clothing plays a very important role within the narratives, it features heavily in the paratexts of these comics. Paratexts are textual elements that are presented alongside and in parallel to the main text. These include the cover art, the advertisements, and for my purposes, most significantly, the paper dolls. These paratexts act as an intermediary space between the reader and the text. It shifts the discussion of clothing and consumerism and self-fashioning away from a fictional space and moves it into the reader's own lives. And whether spatial and ideological separation of reader and text is problematic in Katy because of this creative role that the readers play, the paratexts both reassert and collapse those divides between the child reader and the adult producer of the comic. Of the paratexts, the most significant is the paper doll, that allow the reader to enter completely into the fictional world of the comic and to engage even more actively in the world of their favourite character. Paper dolls are two-dimensional images of figures accompanied by images of clothing and accessories. When the clothes are cut out, they can be attached to the doll by means of tabs that are folded around the paper. So paper dolls offer a space in which readers can play out fantasies of sartorial consumption. They're considered paratext because they bridge the space between reader and text. They look inward and look outward at the same time. They enable the reader to make an intervention within the pages of the periodical and to extract the doll and her accompanying clothes and accessories from it. The paper doll acts as a narrative space, which when detached from the pages becomes a slight but nevertheless three-dimensional site in which the reader may inscribe and describe their own fashion experience. The reader, of course, has a lot of choice and freedom here. They can cut out the doll and all of their clothes, or only some of them. They can use the clothing as a template to create new items. You know, the child doesn't need advanced dressmaking skills to do this, to dress their doll. It's not like a normal three-dimensional doll. And they also open up, I think, possibilities for anarchic and destructive play as well, that if you tire of dressing the doll, she can be pasted onto all kinds of backgrounds, she can be disfigured with a snip of the scissors, she can be scrunched up and thrown away in the bin. Her frailty makes her disposable and infinitely replicable. It's as simple and complex a play thing as the ludic child wants to make her. Through the paper doll, fashion becomes a kind of play for the reader. By engaging with cutting out the doll and dressing her, the reader engages vicariously with other acts of self-fashioning. So we have the next slide, please. So you can see the way the paper dolls are presented in the magazine, lots of different designs, all credited to different readers. You know, there's lots of these things. Sometimes they're for Katy, sometimes they're for other characters in the comics as well. You know, that there's quite a number of different things. We're going to have the next slide, please, as well. You can see the range of things. You know, they cycle through sort of fantasy fashions, butterfly fashions were a recurring theme, cowgirl stuff, I think maybe inspired by Bill Woggin's Ranch. Astronaut stuff became really popular after the moon landings. And you can see, you know, the range of things and the range of play that's possible here. Sometimes interchangeable heads with different expressions on them, things like this. And the next slide as well, please. So you can see if the paper doll wasn't enough for you, you could send away for a durable version. So this is Katy's sister, comes in with a new batch of fan mail and orders for your pin-up and cut-out set. And the postman's walking away in the background saying, "Oh, my back," you know, because there's so many of them. But this too is paratext at play, you know, that the real letter becomes a representation of a letter. Katy says that she'll answer all of these letters herself, you know. If I can, the next slide as well. But if you had a friend sick with polio, you could send Katy their name and address, and Katy would send them a free pin-up, a signed pin-up. But this creates a sense that Katy's a real person, you know, she's like a movie star or a pop singer who can actually autograph these things. What's interesting is to describe them not as paper dolls, but as pin-ups. It's a word that carries eroticized connotations, perhaps. You know, of an item that can be pinned up to a wall as aesthetically pleasing, or otherwise kept for some personal entertainments. Katy then lends a sort of frisson of sexuality to the doll. And while the Katy doll herself is always modestly clad, you know, she always has underwear or a bathing suit on, she's usually presented wearing high heels, a red, open, painted mouth, and it hints at the burlesque. And the resulting image is something that can be used equally by the naive child or by the worldly teenager, as a toy or as a pin-up, as a plaything or as a masturbatory item. And either way, the doll is meant to be detached from the comic, to take on a role separate to the narrative. She's a paratextual item that enables the creation of further fantasy beyond the confines of the periodical. I have the next slide, please. And Katy does act as a slight of fantasy, and this is a word that I think resonates really deeply with the readers of Katy. If I can have the next slide, this is Betsy Johnson talking about it. She says, "She was my lady, my Barbie doll. I could connect with that fantasy." And the next slide as well. And Willie Smith says that Katy was my Vogue, total fantasy. She was the white Diana Ross. And this idea of fantasy, I think, is this hugely resonant word that I would like to try and sort of unpick and unpack, because there's so much going on here with whether this is an unrealistic dream or whether this is a sort of creative narrative space in the terms of like fantasy literature. And she is a fantasy for her readers. You know, she's a model and an actress and a star. She's not an ordinary girl at all. And many of the clothes that the readers produce are suitably fantastic. That Katy's success depends entirely on this community of reader contributors says something important about child agency, that Bill Woggan and the rest of the adults involved in the comic have no role other than to showcase the will of the community. The adult artists take a step back, they acquiesce to the demands of the young readers, and it displaces the usual heteronormative dynamic of production and consumption, allowing a child to become an active, authoritative and empowered user and consumer of fashion, relegating the adult artist to a subordinate role. By submitting their designs and entering competitions and letter pages, the readers of Katy engage with their community, and in doing so engage with a type of self-fashioning by which they present themselves to this community too. While the comics have storylines that centre on high fashion and consumers with financial, cultural and heteronormative power, they also present fashion as a popular consumer product that can be enjoyed by readers who do not normally share in this type of power. By supplementing the narratives with paratextual paper dolls, they put fashion into the child's hands, enabling further acts of creativity and play that extend far beyond the boundaries of the comic. The Katy comics celebrate clothing and encourage the child reader to engage in the fashion industry as both producer and consumer. In this way, Katy encultures its readers as thoughtful and empowered and playful consumers of fashion.